Welcome into another week of Three True Values. It's a big one this week. We're talking SEC and other surrounding conferences. Just those little teams here and there. You hear their name every March, so you might as well talk about them here in October as we start to look at that calendar. We're just about a week or so away from flipping it, getting into November. You know what that means. We are very close to playing some college basketball in the near future. So SEC Media Day has come and gone. I was there. I talked to some of the coaches, some of the players. I'm going to share with you the knowledge I have about the conference in this first segment. When we take a break, we'll come back. We're going to speak with, I promised you guys a special guest, and I delivered, David Cobb of CBS Sports, college basketball analyst. He also covers college football for them as well during this time of the year. We'll talk to him. He's a former Tennessee guy. Of course, I graduated from Alabama, so we might have to talk a little bit of football before we get into the basketball. Don't mind that, though. We will talk plenty of SEC hoops along the way. Then when we come back, like I said, it's not a specific conference, but these teams that you hear about, I'll go ahead and name drop a couple of them just so you're aware of who we'll be talking about. We're talking about your Vermonts. You know, you talk about Ohio a couple of years ago, had that little run. Buffalo seems to stay in that category. Those teams from conferences that we're not going to talk about all year long, but maybe that team becomes a 12, a 13 seed, and now you have to know who they are if you're going to pick them to be the upset team in your bracket. So we'll go ahead, inform you of who those teams are, just a few of them to keep your eye on, because you're going to see in your bracket, you're going to look up and be like, that team was 30-4 over the season. I wonder how good they really are. Also tell you how to really check those numbers, make sure they're as good as they say they are. Make sure that that record's not lying based on level of competition. Then we'll get you out of here. And of course, one more week of our preview series. After this one, we got to finish things out with the ACC. So you're not going to want to miss it. This week, the SEC. Next week is the ACC. As we get into this week's episode, again, like I said, got back from SEC Media Days this past week. Talked to a lot of coaches about a lot of interesting things. And what I was most interested in going into this week, and I kind of, for weeks leading up to this, to give you a peek behind the curtain, what I was most interested in was finding out how these coaches determine which mid-major transfer prospects to go after, and how they know in this transfer portal era where you're relying so much on upperclassmen versus freshmen to give you that big-time scoring boost, to give you that leadership, whatever it is your team needs, you're going to the transfer portal rather than the freshman class to add it immediately. So how do they know that it's going to translate from one level to another? I talked to quite a few coaches. You can find that work at on3.com or on my Twitter feed at JDFletch3. But as we get into our preview of the SEC, I think Tier 1, it's a little tricky. I don't think there's a clear favorite. I think in the SEC, we'll talk about it all year long. We'll go back and forth. We'll talk about the Big 12. We'll talk about the Big 10, and we'll talk about the SEC. Those three are going to be fighting for the title of the best conference in college basketball. And I think it'll shift back and forth depending on what happens in those early season games, those tournaments, the MTEs as they call them. And we'll see, we'll start to paint a picture. Then we'll get to conference play. We'll see what they do against each other. How much do they kind of knock each other's resumes? Who's able to separate themselves above the competition? That'll come in the springtime. But for now, we know that the Big 10 and the Big 12 have this group at the top. The SEC, I think the closest thing they have to that top tier team is either Tennessee or Kentucky. And I think it's for completely opposite reasons. Tennessee brings back a lot of veteran talent to that roster. Josiah Jordan-James and Santiago Vescovi leading the way. They test the NBA draft waters. They end up back in the college ranks. That's huge for Rick Barnes' squad. But they're also going to rely heavily on Jordan Gainey and Dalton Knecht. Two guys who in theory add exactly what they need as two perimeter shooters. Knecht, a guy who will provide three-point spacing from the forward position, Gainey, a guy who can keep the ball in his hand and create three-point shots for himself. Rick Barnes raved about their ability to shoot from the perimeter. Will they be able to mesh into his defense-first scheme? That's something that I think might be a little bit oversold, if I'm being honest. We talk about the importance of defensive players being in that system, but then again, look at Rick Barnes' teams. They've always been good on defense. That's never been the question with his groups. And so is that a factor of only going and getting defensive players? I think more likely the way that they're scheming it, the way that they're teaching it in practice is having a positive impact on each player's ability to perform on the defensive end. You look at a guy like Zakai Ziegler. He doesn't stand out as an elite defender given his size. But the way he works in that system, the way he prepares, the way that he plays, he's able to fit in with Tennessee. And I think there's no reason that those two, if they fit with the culture, if they're able to connect, I don't think there's any reason to believe those two won't have the same result. Kentucky, complete opposite. We're talking about almost exclusively freshmen making an impact on this team, especially early when it sounds like Ugo Onyenso may not be ready to go. Possibly he will be. It's been played very close to the vest with him and Bradshaw. And now Zvonimir Ivicic, Big Z as they call him in the fan base, there's questions about will he be ready? Can he play a major role early? They got him enrolled. They got him here. But how much can he contribute early as he adjusts to the level of physicality, to the new rules of the game, as he gets into better condition throughout the fall? That remains to be determined. So for now, the only sure thing in that Kentucky front court is Trey Mitchell, who, of course, they got lucky to get from West Virginia after Bob Huggins and that situation which took place. So you look at this Kentucky team, and I think the roster building was very unique. It's something that we don't often see. There were rumors about not only Antonio Reeves, but Ugo as well early in this cycle. Now they end up getting both of them back. Adu Tiero, not sure how big of a role he's going to play. I think Jordan Burks has as good, the unheralded freshman that they bring in late in this class, along with Joey Hart. I think he's got as much of a chance to make a real impact as Tiero does. So I think it's really going to be heavy on DJ Wagner, on Robert Dillingham, on Justin Edwards, and those guys, that freshman class. I think it's going to be heavy on them to produce. Reed Shepherd even coming off the bench, trying to fill that Devin Booker role almost from a few years ago. I know that's a big comp if you're going to throw that name out there. But just in terms of his role within the college system, people forget Devin Booker came off the bench for that team. I think it's just a big unknown. And I think that's the general overarching theme with most of the SEC. Because Arkansas is in this second category, leading the way. Right next to them is Alabama. And you look at those two teams, both of them relying heavily on transfers to make a big impact right away. Arkansas with Khalif Battle, with Tremont Mark, with L. Ellis. They need those guys to be big scorers for them. Jeremiah Davenport comes in. He'll provide them some help on the wing, playing defensively. Then you look at Alabama. Two mid-major guys, probably going to be their leading scorers in Aaron Estrada and Grant Nelson. Latrell Wrightsell also comes in. He's a really good 3-and-D guard to add to that mix. They bring in Wegu from West Virginia. Similar situation there as how Kentucky was able to get their guy. So Alabama, there's a lot of versatility in how they can play. They got Jaron Stevenson also to reclassify, into this class, commit to Alabama. He's at 6'11" now listed on the roster. He has grown since the last time he was measured by these recruiting services. So how does that change how he's able to play? Reports are he looks really good in the preseason. Some comparing him, and I'm not going to give too much away here, but some comparing him to Noah Clowney last season, who, of course, jumped into the first round after being one of their lower-ranked recruits in the class. And so I think overall you look at both of these teams, Arkansas and Alabama, and you say, well, there's a lot left to prove. These groups, as they are currently constructed, have not really shown us anything because they're so new and they're relying so heavily on things to translate to the next level. However, both coaches also have a very good track record, particularly in recent years, of making those systems work. And so, do we put them in that same tier with Kentucky and Tennessee? I lean towards yes. I think it's pretty much a four-way tie here at the top for who I like as the favorite in this conference. I can't pick between the four of them. But I think that perhaps this next tier of teams is where you'll find a bit more intrigue. Texas A&M, Missouri. Yes, that's right. I have Missouri up here in this second tier. Auburn, also in this class with them. And I think these three, which make up 5 through 7 in the conference, Texas A&M picked by many to win this conference. And I don't think that they are incapable of doing so. I think they've got a really good team that could potentially win the SEC title, led by Wade Taylor, of course. But you look at that Texas A&M team, and where is the upward potential? We know what they're going to be. I think with all four of those, we identified major question marks, but the upside is there. You look at Kentucky, and what if DJ Wagner looks like a top 3 pick in the NBA draft? What if you go to Arkansas and you see Khalif Battle and L. Ellis both putting up the kinds of numbers they did at their schools last year? What if you look at Alabama, and Grant Nelson looks like the Grant Nelson at North Dakota State, but against SEC competition? They all have high upside. Tennessee as well. You look at that defensive scheme of Rick Barnes. You couple that with three-point shooting, talking about a dangerous team. But Texas A&M, what do they have this year that separates them from last year? I don't see much. Now, does that mean they shouldn't be the favorites to win the conference title? No, I think in the preseason, actually, they're a safe pick at the top because we know what they're going to be. But we'll see how it plays out through the season because I'm betting that at least one of those four will make that next jump. But Texas A&M, pretty much a lock, I think, to be in that NCAA tournament conversation when we get to the end of it. I think another team that many people won't think is a lock, but I think should be considered one, is Missouri. Missouri under Dennis Gates burst onto the scene, shocked everyone last year with how they were able to mesh together and create a team that went from being picked right at the bottom and among the bottom teams in all of the Power Five, rising through the ranks to become an NCAA tournament team. They've built on that success. They had a good transfer portal haul. They bring back Caleb Brown, the brother of Kobe Brown. They say he has made good strides this season. You get back I think, an important piece in Nick Honor, a veteran guard going into either his 6th or 7th year, I believe, in college basketball, a guy who's been around the block. You won't find more experience at the guard position than what Missouri has this season. Connor Vanover comes in, gives them a different look at center. Will he start? Will he come off the bench? How much will he play for that team? That remains to be determined. But I think that given what we saw last year, how it was able to fit together, I think this year we owe Dennis Gates a little bit of our trust that he's going to be able to do it again. Now, if they're not able to live up to the expectations, at least that I have set on them, I don't know how other people feel. We'll ask David Cobb in the next segment. But then I think you start to take a step back. Next year, we don't put them in the same class, despite bringing in a very good freshman class next year. We make them prove it to us one more time. Auburn under Bruce Pearl, it's been a little bit on and off in recent years. And I know that, don't get me wrong, the highs have been incredible. We're talking Final Four potential when they are at their peak. But then it seems like he's gone through this little period where it's on for a year, off for a year, on for a year, off for a year. Well, this year, can they turn it on? They bring in an interesting group of players incoming. Aiden Holloway should give them a big scoring boost from the guard position. You bring back Jalen Williams, bring back Janai Broom. I think those are huge retentions for the front court, particularly Broom, who, from all accounts, had some NBA interest at some level, but decided that he would come back and work on the things that he was given by those scouts, by those front offices. You then bring in Chaney Johnson, Denver Jones, two local guys. Chaney Johnson in particular, I think one of the most interesting transfers in the SEC. He comes from Division II. Can he make that leap? What is the gap between those two levels of competition, and how quickly can he adjust to it? How quickly can he make a real impact for Auburn? That remains to be determined. This next group here includes Mississippi State, who I think really was in that tier above until the Tolu Smith injury, and that's going to be a big storyline. Can they fill that gap at center? What do they have to really plug that hole? Because Jimmy Bell right now would be in line to be that guy, and Jimmy Bell has not ever proven to be a Tolu Smith level player to this point in his college career. Now, that doesn't mean that he can't come out and have a big season. You look, and they've also got Keyshawn Murphy. They've got DJ Jeffries. Sean Jones, can he make a leap? He showed little bursts here and there of what he could be. I think that they're an interesting team. They bring in Andrew Taylor from Marshall, a guard who I think is intriguing as a point guard. He's got height. He's got a little bit of playmaking, a little bit of shooting. What does he look like in this system under Chris Jans? But that Tolu Smith injury, it's going to hang over them. They're going to have to survive the non-conference schedule. Florida in this group, and I think Florida, an interesting team to look at here as they bring back Riley Kugel. Walter Clayton transfers in, Zion Pullen. They had one of the biggest transfer classes as well, Tyrese Samuel, who apparently performed well, according to reports, this past week in a scrimmage that Florida won. They've also got a lot of international prospects. Talk to Todd Golden about that, what that adds, some of the benefits of bringing in these guys. And he seems to be committed to bringing in more foreign players throughout his time at Florida. But one of the things about this team that I think is the most interesting is you look at the three-point shooting across the board. Obviously, Tyrese Samuel, not a three-point shooter. Micah Hendlogton, not a three-point shooter. Outside of that, though, a lot of guys who can spread the floor, who can knock down threes. And so how good can they be as a three-point shooting team? I think if they can be a 35, 36 plus, I mean, if they can be above 36% as a team, I think they can be move into that next tier of locks to go to the NCAA tournament. For now, though, they're right there. I think they're on the right side of the bubble now, but these next two teams I think are right there, but on the wrong side of the bubble. That's Ole Miss. Chris Beard comes in. Obviously, the storyline with him will never just be basketball again. It will always include that cliff note about what happened at Texas, being arrested for domestic violence. The charges were dropped. He had already been fired from his job at Texas, but quickly lands at Ole Miss. So now, how does he rehabilitate his image? How does he build trust with that team, with that community, and with recruits moving forward? That will be what you have to watch. Off to a good start in terms of bringing in kids. He has a fantastic class of players incoming. Still two that he's waiting on decisions with waivers, that being Brandon Murray and Musa Cisse. Both would be big additions to this roster, so it's very hard to predict what this team really can be. Matthew Morrell, of course, will be very good for this team. You've got Alan Flanagan coming in on the wing from Auburn, his dad joining the coaching staff, a pre-existing relationship with Chris Beard dating way back to the time at Arkansas Little Rock that they spent together on a coaching staff. So there's a lot of new faces down there at Ole Miss. How does it mesh together? And then can they get, I mean, we're talking about Musa Cisse, a conference player of the year candidate, and Brandon Murray, a guy who has scored double digits at times during his college career. But both making their second transfer without graduating, so they will need waivers. LSU rounds out this group because they've got some talent. They bring in some players. You got Fountain. You've got, I think LSU is in an interesting spot because they had to flip the roster, of course, when Matt McMahon came in. And then things did not go exactly how they planned last year. They wanted it to be a quick transition. Let's start winning quickly. Well, when that doesn't happen, some of the guys leave, but then you're able to bring in new guys to replace them. They bring in Jordan Wright. They bring in Damian Collins. They bring in Carlos Stewart, Jalen Cook. And so now you're talking about a second straight year of flipping the roster in a major way. How does Derek Fountain mix in with those guys? Milwaukee Wilkinson as well, Trey Hannibal. How do they all fit together? I think that I forgot to say Will Baker as well, a big man who they will use, no doubt, throughout the season. So how do they all fit together? How do they mesh? What does that team actually look like out on the floor? I think that they're a question mark, but I do think that they have bubble potential. And as we move into this last group, we round out this conversation about the SEC. I think near the bottom, I think the top of this group being Georgia, I think Mike White is starting to build something there. I just don't quite think it's there yet. I think that Georgia losing Kario Okindo was a big loss for them. I think that with him, I think I would view this team a little bit differently. But he's no longer there, and so we have to look at what they now have. RJ Melendez comes in. Russell Chewa comes in. Jalen DeLoach. Can those guys do enough to change this team? I'm not quite sure they're there yet. Noah Thomason also has gotten good reviews in the preseason for what he's been able to do since transferring. I think that maybe the most interesting player on this team, RJ Sonohara, 6'8", listed as a guard. He's a guy from Nova Southeastern transferring in, but his numbers were fantastic there. How does that translate to this next level? Playing at the SEC against SEC competition. What does that look like for him? So for Mike White, I think he's still kind of molding this roster into what he wants it to be. You look at this group of guys and you say, well, they've got talent there. Can this piece go with this piece? How does this fit together? I just feel like it's a year or two away from really clicking together the way that it can under Mike White. So we talk about these last two teams, Vanderbilt here at 13th. And I think that for them, the difference between landing here and landing in that bottom spot was, and I don't think that it's even particularly a debate, but Tyron Lawrence entering the transfer portal, drawing interest. There were SEC teams that wanted to bring him in. He opts to go back to Vanderbilt, finish his career there. I think that was big for Jerry Stackhouse. You bring in Vin Allen Lubin. I think he's a guy who can make a contribution. He was a freshman at Notre Dame last season. I liked him as a prospect coming in. We didn't see him put up huge numbers, but I think he's a guy who can grow throughout his college career and offer more to that team. Then we round things out with South Carolina down here at the bottom. They bring back Nietzsche Johnson. They bring in some help in the transfer portal, Talon Cooper, among the biggest names. And I do want to say this because at SEC Media Day, Lamont Paris, he seemed rather upset, really, that he was picked last in the conference. And now here I am, I'm picking him last in the conference. But I don't think it says as much about South Carolina because I believe there will be growth there. Now, last year was rough, particularly the G.G. Jackson situation. You bring in that caliber of five-star freshman, a guy who reclassified to join you, decommitted from North Carolina to be part of your program, and then it turned sour the way it did. The questions that are raised the way they were. Then he goes on to the NBA, becomes a second-round pick when many believed he would end up being a lottery-type guy. Now he was super young. I'm not pinning any of the mistakes that he made on Lamont Paris by any means, but it changes the way you're perceived and the way your season was perceived. That was perceived as an unmitigated failure. That was a very inexperienced team. This year's team brings back a lot more experience. They brought in some experienced guys. So I see Lamont Paris's point. Look, last year we weren't even picked last. And that's only true because people thought that Missouri would be bad. Others thought Vanderbilt would be bad. They ended up exceeding expectations, which meant that somebody had to move down to the bottom. And so while I get his frustration with, look, I built a better roster. Why are we being picked last? So did the other teams. That's the reality of the SEC now, is that each team can go build a better roster than they had the year before. Every one of them has that opportunity. If you get worse from year to year as an SEC team, and that does not mean by record or by when you exited the tournament, but if your team drops noticeably in the level that you play, it is because you missed on players. Whether that's Kentucky missing on a 5-star recruit. So now suddenly they start to fall down. If that's at Alabama, say one of these mid-major guys, it doesn't pan out. Well, now they're not at that level. They don't have a guy who can produce at the level Brandon Miller did for them last year. Or guys, plural, filling in that role at the very least. So if you're South Carolina, I understand the frustration. I understand why you don't want to be picked last, why you feel like you should not be. But the reality is right now, you are the team that has proven the least in this conference. So time to prove it. Some bulletin board material for sure. And I want nothing but the best for that program. I hope that they are able to prove that wrong, push somebody else down to the bottom of this conference. As we wrap up our SEC talk, though, we will come back. We're going to keep talking about the Southeastern Conference with David Cobb of CBS Sports. You won't want to miss it, so stay tuned right here on 3 True Values. Welcome back into 3 True Values. We have David Cobb from CBS Sports. He covers a little bit of everything for him over there, college football and college basketball. I know he's still busy focusing on some college football, but he's turning his eyes towards college basketball, getting ready for the season, just like we are, as we start talking about the SEC and what that conference has going this season. And David, I think I want to start here with a little bit of a cross between sports. What are your thoughts on Tennessee versus Alabama football and then basketball?
I knew you were going to bring that up. We got an Alabama guy hosting the show, a Tennessee guy as the guest. So it makes sense that, the first half was great. I mean, Tennessee played about as well as it could. But then in the second half, I thought Alabama, and I wrote this for CBS Sports, Alabama, to me, changed the perception or changed the ceiling about what they could accomplish this season with how good they looked in that second half. Because they played as well in the second half against Tennessee. They played better in the second half against Tennessee than they have at any point this season. And the version of Alabama that I saw in the second half of that game against Tennessee is a version of Alabama that can not only win the SEC title, but legitimately compete for the national title. And I didn't know going into Saturday that Alabama had that in them. I just wasn't sure, but then it clicked in all facets. And you saw, I think, like the ultimate version of complementary football, to use a coaching term, because the special teams, the defense, and the offense all clicked in unison. And that made Alabama very, very scary.
Right. And I think now to turn towards basketball a little bit, those two teams, they're going to be up near the top of the conference, obviously with Kentucky, with Arkansas. But Rick Barnes is doing a little bit different than Nate Oates is doing. Rick Barnes, he brings back a lot of the top talent from last year's roster. Of course, Josiah Jordan-James and Santiago Vescovi leading the way there. Alabama is going to be relying on their best production to come from mid-major transfers. So which method do you think in the modern college basketball era, we've seen it done a million different ways, which of those two do you see working, maybe not early, because I think Tennessee probably works better early, but which one gets you further in March?
Yeah, I like Tennessee's roster better than Alabama's roster this season. I'm a little bit lower on Alabama and Kentucky than a lot of people. I think because of how good Nate Oates has been and because of the amount of talent that Kentucky has, people are just writing them in as top 4 teams in the league. In our predictions for CBS Sports, I have Alabama 5 and Kentucky 6. And I do have a lot of belief in Nate Oates, and I do have a lot of belief in the talent at Kentucky. However, this is going to be a really, really good league this year. And you've got teams like Arkansas, Auburn, Tennessee, Texas A&M at the top. And Alabama, Kentucky at 5 and 6 are still NCAA tournament teams, right? And they certainly are good enough to cycle up. I just get a little bit nervous when I look at Alabama here. All right, we got Mark Sears and Rylan Griffin back. And Nick Pringle played a little bit last year, right?
Yeah, he got some late minutes, and he looked good in those minutes, but it wasn't a big sample size.
Yeah, so Aaron Estrada, I had him ranked in my top 50 transfers. Grant Nelson, I had him ranked in my top 50 transfers. And then Reitzel, right, who's coming from Fullerton. These are all players who should theoretically be really good. You just don't know, though. And I get nervous when you rely on so many of the transfer up guys.
Yeah.
Because one of them will probably be great, one of them will be okay, and then one of them will probably underperform. Or in a disaster scenario, all 3 of them kind of are a bust.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a scenario, too, in which Nate Oates has nailed this thing. It's just so much different than last year's Alabama team where they relied on freshmen and veteran guards. And I don't know. I don't know what to make of this Crimson Tide group. You've got a good read on them. Like, I'm curious to know kind of where you're at on them going into the year.
Yeah, I think they're definitely one of the biggest unknowns in college basketball because they bring in pretty much 3 of the guys you're going to rely on to be top 6 rotation players from a major jump. You've got Grant Nelson coming from North Dakota State. You've got Aaron Estrada coming from Hofstra. And the thing with Aaron Estrada, and I agree, like clearly his body of work says that he is a top 50 transfer, that he's one of the best mid-major transfers making the jump up to the SEC. I would have slight pause, not a lot, but we've seen him at the high major level before. And he was not the impact guy at Oregon that they're expecting him to be at Alabama. Now, there's plenty of room for growth over those years that he spent in between those 2 stops, but it would give me some pause relying on him to be the 20-point per game guy that he was at Hofstra at the higher level. And so I think that's going to be the big question for Alabama. How well do those guys translate? And that's what I asked a bunch of SEC coaches throughout the SEC Media Day this past week was, how do you know that a mid-major transfer is going to put up the same numbers in the SEC that he did at that level? I thought the answers were really enlightening. It was one of my favorite, like just the whole week, I was just looking through the quotes, even outside of the article that I wrote, just kind of going like, this really speaks to each coach's philosophy. You got Rick Barnes telling me you can't rely at all. You have no idea until they get on campus what's going to happen. You've got Todd Golding, who's telling me, well, we've got all the analytics behind it. We have all these algorithms. We scout them out by looking at this number and this number. And then you got guys like Musselman who are like, oh, we've got this secret formula. We've got everything.
Hey, he's the one I trust.
We talk to everybody. We talk to their old coaches, their new coaches. We talk to people that played against them, all kinds of stuff. And then you've got a guy like Dennis Gates, who I think coaches one of the most interesting teams in the SEC, broke onto the scene last year. He basically said, I can take any player in the country and make them work as long as my culture works. And so I think that it just really speaks to the type of coach each SEC coach is in the way they approach these transfers coming in.
Yeah,
so
I love
I'm interested to see what you think about that.
Well, I love that. And the one I would trust more than anybody is Eric Musselman.
Yeah.
On that topic. He has been doing this for years. Before the transfer portal was even a twinkle in the NCAA's eye, he was bringing guys in at Nevada, having them sit out a year, and then plugging them in as after their sit out year and having a ton of success and going to the NCAA tournament. So he gets to Arkansas. The rest of the country starts trying to do this. And he's like, well, I've already been doing this for a long time. I know exactly what I want. I mean, think about this, right? It looks like L. Ellis at Arkansas might come off the bench. Right. And I mean, at least he could, right? Maybe he starts. but like he might be their fifth or sixth best player. He was the best player at Louisville last year, the best player at a historically great program. Granted, it was a terrible year for Louisville, but still, you bring in a guy like El Ellis, and then Tremont Mark. Now, really, Arkansas didn't go heavy on the mid-major transfers. They got Leaf Battle and Jeremiah Davenport, both of whom I believe were at Temple.
Davenport at Cincinnati.
Davenport, but both out of the AAC.
But both out of the AAC, correct.
Yeah, so Arkansas is the team I trust. That's why I have them up at 3 in my preseason predictions for the SEC this season. Even though, they obviously lose a ton from last season. But when it comes to bringing in the transfers and making it work, in Must I trust, baby. And I'm going to ride with the Hogs to have another really good year. And then you mentioned Tennessee and their philosophy. Here's my concern about Tennessee. And granted, I'm high on the Vols. I got them at 2 in my prediction. But they brought in Dalton Knecht from Northern Colorado, a 3-point shooter.
Yeah.
And they brought in Justin Gainey from USC Upstate, who is the son of one of the assistants on that team.
Yeah.
And both those guys have shown the ability to shoot the 3-point shot during the course of their careers at the lower level. Where I get worried with Rick Barnes in Tennessee is that these guys haven't come from hard-nosed defensive philosophies. So Rick Barnes, being this guy who's built an elite defensive program, here's what I see happening in November and December. Those guys get on the floor, not 90 seconds into their time on the floor, they make a defensive mistake and he yanks them, right?
Yeah.
And then what does that do to your confidence as a shooter when you can't get on the floor and be in rhythm offensively because you're in your own head about the way the coach wants to play defense?
Yeah, we know you gotta get in the rhythm if you're gonna start hitting those threes. You gotta feel the flow of the game.
Yeah, and then maybe Tennessee just becomes a similar version of itself from years past where it's great defensively, but the guys who they need to shoot can't get it going for whatever reason. So there's a roundabout sort of look at a few of those schools in terms of what those mid-major transfers, what I think they could bring.
Right, for sure. And I think as we move forward, there's 2 teams that I want to talk about. I think they're a little bit sleepers. I don't want to. Texas A&M, they're not a sleeper. Like, people are picking them to win the conference, but it feels like nobody cares. Like you say Texas A&M is going to win the conference, and everyone's like, okay, yeah, sure. Like, all right, cool. Wade Taylor, Buzz Williams. Yeah, all right. And there's no hype. There is no hype around Texas A&M, but they feel like they are the most sure thing in the SEC right now.
Yeah, no, think about it. Is there an NBA draft prospect on that roster?
Not straight to the NBA. You've got like 1 or 2 who maybe they prove it in the G League, but there's nobody who's going straight to the NBA.
Right. And is there a former 5-star prospect on that roster? No. So you look at A&M, and that's why there's no hype, because there's no one player. Often this time of year in college basketball, the buzz is generated around Isaiah Collier, Bronny James, the Kentucky freshman,
right?
Aiden Holloway at Auburn, I'm sure was a big talking point at SEC Basketball Media Day. Texas A&M doesn't have that. They've got Wade Taylor, but even he, as one of the best returning players in the league, is not an NBA draft prospect or somebody who is just a human highlight reel. He's an amazing player and should be the preseason pick to win SEC Player of the Year. But yeah, there's just nothing particularly flashy about A&M. It's also not a basketball school, but they are my pick to win the league. I think there's 5 or 6 teams that could win the league, but A&M deserves that respect with what they bring back from a team that was really, really good last season.
Yeah, nobody overachieved last year like Missouri did. Dennis Gates, I think, shocked everyone. That jump from Cleveland State to Missouri, I think a lot of people questioned if he could make it. Felt like he got the job a little bit earlier than people thought he would get one of these big opportunities. But if he wants to preach culture, this is the time to do it. You just showed all of us that you took a group of guys that we didn't put any expectations on and won a lot of basketball games. So as he builds this next recruiting class as well, what have you seen from Dennis Gates, and is it sustainable? Like, can he really build Missouri into something here?
I think the jury is still out on that to a certain extent, but my gosh, what an incredible start. And I do believe him when he talks about their culture. I spent a little bit of time around them at the SEC tournament last year, and one of the things these players were talking to me about was how they brought in basically like a team bonding like psychologist guy before the season who really like had a major impact on the chemistry that developed there and the bond that those guys developed. Because you got to remember when Dennis Gates came in there and took over for Conzo Martin, he revamped that roster almost to like a Deion Sanders level.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about bringing in mid-majors. I mean, he had guys from schools you've never heard of coming out of that roster.
Yeah, he did. And they put it all together in a way that I don't think anybody expected. And really, their most high-profile transfer was Isaiah Mosley, and he didn't even do anything for him last season. So what he did with Kobe Brown and those guys was spectacular. The chemistry piece is huge for them, and I believe him when he talks about that. So I've got Missouri at 7 on nothing more than blind trust, because I like some of their guards, veteran guards that are coming back there. I don't know what they're going to do in the front court, though, because they brought in Connor Vanover, who's been around the block, Arkansas, Oral Roberts. He's not exactly a 30-minute-a-game bruiser, though. He's sort of a 7'4" stretch center, kind of strange situation there. So, I mean, he's a interesting player, but that's my concern. My question for Mizzou is, are they going to be able to bruise on the block in this league? But I love Dennis Gates. I love that class he's assembling. It's just, you can't in this era, and Missouri fans know this as well as anybody because of the way that Conzo recruited. He recruited pretty well. He brought in the Porter brothers, right? And freshman recruiting is essential. It's big. It still matters, but it's not everything anymore. Yeah. Kentucky fans will tell you that, right? And so they've got a blockbuster 2024 class coming together. I think it might still be ranked number 1 some places in the team ratings. But what is that as much gold as we used to believe that it is. So I think he's got them on a great trajectory. I think they're a fringe NCAA tournament team, but I don't really know, looking at this roster, who your all SEC performer is at Missouri.
Right. You mentioned Van over there. Let me talk about SEC Media Day being there. I don't feel short very often, despite being around basketball players all the time. It's a whole different game standing next to him. I just think you're looking straight up in the air talking to that guy. But this is my last question. We're going to get you out of here, but I have to ask it. We talked about it last year when you came on the show. Big year for John Calipari. Is this we said last year it's the year before the year. Is it still is everything hanging on this season for John Calipari?
Yeah, look at how good this freshman class is. And if he can't make it happen, okay, here's the standard he has to meet, in my mind. He has to meet the standard that John Shire set last season for a roster full of freshmen. Because Kentucky reminds me a lot of Duke from a year ago and how counterculture they are to the rest of college basketball right now in the over-reliance on freshmen. And the difference, obviously, is that this is not John Calipari's first season as a head basketball coach, like it was for John Shire. But if you just kind of take that element of it out and look at the rosters, I mean, Duke had Jeremy Roach last season. Kentucky has Antonio Reeves, right? So veteran guard. Kentucky has Trey Mitchell. Duke had Ryan Young. I mean, you could argue that Trey Mitchell is a little better than Ryan Young, but still, after that, it is all freshmen. And okay, Adu Thiero might play a little bit, whatever. But I just don't trust a team like that in this era to be a league title contender. Duke got it together in the end. They won the ACC tournament. They got eliminated in a round of 32. That's kind of what I see with Kentucky. A team that's going to struggle at first, probably get it together at some point, and then wilt in the end because they're going to be too young and not physical enough once March rolls around to really hang. And where does that leave John Calipari? My gosh, I don't know what that buyout is, but it was toxic at times last year. They got it on the rails and salvaged some dignity. I don't know. It feels very uncertain for John Calipari at Kentucky right now.
Yeah, and you talk about that recruiting class kind of made this the make or break year. We pushed it off last season the whole time saying, well, look at what he's got coming in. You've got to let him coach that team.
Right.
I mean, obviously, Kentucky is going to do well on the market here. I have no question about that. Just brought in Boogie Flan, but he doesn't have the same names and rankings that he had this time last year. to kind of go into the season saying, well, make sure that you give me more time with this next roster. So I think it's going to be a big year for him. We'll see how long the fan base takes before they start to rumble, start to talk about things. Because right now it's all hype. They feel good about the freshmen that are coming in. I mean,
they won the global jam. They won the global
jam. They've been hanging out with Drake. They got some new OVO merch. Blue and white game always gets everybody hyped up. They're ready for it. And we'll see if they can get these big men healthy too. That'll be a big factor.
Okay, let me ask you this: like, you were there at SEC Media Day. What's sort of the buzz around? And help me with the pronunciation here, but Zvonimir Ivicic, right?
Yeah,
the Croatian
Ivicic.
Because he's going to have to play, because if Onyenso and Bradshaw are out to start the season, like, they're going to actually need him.
Yeah, it was kind of a weird vibe, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of excitement within the fan base, but John Calipari almost tempered it in an answer to one of the questions. I can't remember who asked it, but he kind of said, because of the way his recruitment went down and because they were waiting on enrollment and all the things that go with bringing in an international prospect, he said each week he got better and better. And he actually said, this was one of the funniest quotes of the day. He said, by the end, people thought he was King Kong. Like, it was just, is he going to come in here and just dominate the game and change college basketball forever? Like, no, I don't think so. And I think that was evident when he didn't even play in the blue-white game, because they're still working him into the flow here. He hasn't been playing American college basketball, totally different brand of basketball, slightly different rules than the overseas game. So he's going to have an adjustment period, but you're right. They're probably going to have to rely on him at some point during the season.
That's a sketchy situation with Bradshaw, Onyenso, bringing in the Croatian who enrolls late. Like,
I was informed though that they don't like Onyenso. It's Ugo. It's just Ugo.
Oh, okay, all right.
that's from John Calipari at the podium, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Hey, it's October. I am very much still working out my pronunciations in the college basketball world at the moment. Yeah. But yeah, I'm fascinated by that Kentucky front court. Here's my concern on Bradshaw, right? And this is hypothetical, but does his camp try to do a Shaden Sharp or something if this gets to November, December, and he's looking good in mock drafts, but the knee or whatever it is still kind of sketchy, right? Like, that's very speculative, but like, that happens, and
I can if we're looking at worst case scenarios for John Calipari, that's it. I mean, it's Ivicic doesn't pan out and Bradshaw looks around and says, yeah, maybe I'll just get ready. I mean, I think that gets John Calipari as close to the hot seat as he's ever been.
Yeah. We'll see. Trey Mitchell helps, but I don't know if he's enough of a bruiser to get him through SEC play.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for talking some SEC hoops. And that is David Cobb of CBS Sports. Why don't you let them know where they can follow you and keep up with your work?
Yeah, it's David W. Cobb on Twitter. And, of course, at CBS, we've got all of our preseason college basketball content rolling off the presses. So, James, you and I are both Memphians. It is never the wrong time of year to talk about college basketball in the city of Memphis. So it's fun to connect and talk a little hoops.
For sure. Thanks for coming on.
No problem. Thanks.
Welcome back into Three True Values. Want to thank David Cobb once again for coming on the show. Always a pleasure to talk to him. I love bringing him in here and chatting hoops with him. And of course, as an Alabama grad, him being a Tennessee grad, just had to take that quick little shot at the start of the interview. But as we wrap up the show here today, we'll be brief. I know it's been a little bit long, a little bit longer, particularly than the last couple of episodes. We got in depth, talked a lot about the SEC, and then went in depth with David Cobb in the second segment. So we'll keep it brief here. I've got 5 teams from the mid-major level who you need to remember their name once we get to NCAA tournament time. Vermont. Every year it feels like Vermont is right there. It feels like they're a 13 or a 14 seed, and it feels like they've got a chance to beat whoever they play. So Vermont, for me, I want to keep an eye on them. How do you keep an eye on them? You say, I'm not going to be watching Vermont I doubt they're going to be in your game of the week category very often. You're right. But KenPom offers a number of tools, even in the free version. If you want to pay, upgrade to that paid version, a lot there for you to look at. But even the free version, it can tell you what kind of offense they are running. That can inform you on potential matchup nightmares. You know that the 3 seed in that bracket come March struggles with speed. Well, if Vermont's offensive tempo ranks high within the nation, now you know there's a potential matchup nightmare. You can look at how they perform against different types of teams, their strength of schedule. You can look at even their luck, how that's factored in. That's only something that Ken Pomeroy knows, but I think it's an excellent tool, and there's more like it out there. Sagarin, of course, has some. You can then look at quad wins through the NCAA's system, the net rankings. So there's a number of ways to look at these teams and figure out who has what it takes to compete against the bigger teams. Second on this list, UNC Asheville. They got back Drew Pember, guys. I don't know if that got enough attention. I think a lot of people that I talked to assumed that he would enter the transfer portal and go to an SEC school. He decides to go back and dominate for one more year. We're talking about a guy who's going to put up 20 and 10 type numbers every night. So a team to watch out for sure. Charleston, I think the way that they play basketball, you just have to keep them on your radar now. It feels like the last couple of years with that brand that they play, they are a danger no matter who they match up with in that first round of the NCAA tournament, provided they're able to make it. Furman makes the list. I think the Paladins are one of those sneaky teams that seems to pop up year in and year out on your bracket. Maybe not every year, but you remember them because they've come close enough, or they've upset your team, or they've done something that made you remember them and go, yeah, next year I'm riding with them. Can they do it again? We'll see as the year goes on how they are able to translate their success from past years to this season. And finally, Samford. I think I've been watching Bucky McMillan building that program, building that roster. He's brought in various guys. I think this year could be at the point where they're able to push over that hump and get into the NCAA tournament. And what if they do, the style of basketball they play will be dangerous. I'm telling you that right now. So that's all we've got for you on this episode of 3 True Values. Next week, as promised, we will talk ACC and AAC. That's right. We will be talking about the ACC and the American Conference. We'll have breakdowns of both conferences, and we will talk to an expert in that middle segment as we do each and every week during our conference preview slate. We're getting really close to college basketball, guys. Just a couple weeks away. We'll have more guests in here to break down the early season for you, to talk you through what you need to know about everything across college basketball. Hope you enjoy it here on 3 True Values. Once again, I'm your host, James Fletcher.